Can I go ahead? Welcome to the Detroit Institute of Arts, Thursdays at the Museum program. I'm Valerie Mercer, curator and department head of the Center for African American Art at the Detroit Institute of Arts. Today, in celebration of Black History Month, docent chairs Howard Rosenberg and Henney will present In Our Voice, African American Artists. If you'd like to ask a question during the program, you can do so by selecting the Q&A icon in the top right of your screen. This event is being recorded, so if you'd like to watch it again later, you can follow the same link. Just to say a few things about the collection, it started in 1943 when the Federal Art Project that had funded artists gave them work during the Depression. When it disbanded in 43, it distributed a lot of the art they had remaining there, really a huge amount of art. They started to gift it to various museums around the country. And the DIA got quite a lot of wonderful pieces. And we got work by African American artists like Sergeant Johnson and a few others. These were works on paper. And from there, it sort of grew sporadically. I think the first painting we got was by Robert Seldon Johnson, and that was The Plight of the Drunkard. And that came in a few years later. That's our first painting. But then over the years, at first it was sporadic, but it has really kept up very nicely in recent years, probably starting maybe in the 90s. And now, we present regularly to the collections committee to purchase art by African American artists. So we're very excited to have you join us for the program, and our docents will help you learn much more about the program. Now I'm going to turn it over to Howard and Ray. They're going to talk to you about the pieces in the special collection.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you very much for that introduction. We are excited to be here today with you. Ray and I are going to be talking about a number of the iconic pieces in the African American collection. So just to give you a quick background, as Valerie said, the collection began starting in 1943. In 2000, through a generous grant from General Motors, leadership of the DIA, and Valerie Mercer, our curator, the department dedicated a number of galleries to the Center for African American Art. The DIA's collection, it heightens awareness of the creative contribution of Black artists from the 19th century to the present day. It provides a lens through which to explore issues of race, gender, politics, and culture. And so let's get started. What we're looking at is the first of 22 screen prints by Jacob Lawrence called the John Brown series. Jacob Lawrence was an artist of the Harlem Renaissance. His career spanned both coasts. He began working, he grew up in Atlantic City where he lived and worked. He went to Harlem where he was part of the Harlem Renaissance, which in a sentence was a time of great cultural awakening among African American artists. In 1971, he moved to Seattle, where he became a professor of art at the University of Washington, and he lived on 37th Street, which is actually down, a few blocks away from where my daughter lives. I've driven there. It's just quite an interesting, feeling close to this artist, who's one of my favorite artists. In terms of art genres, he's really considered a historian. He paints his historical series of pieces, and art historians rank history paintings on the hierarchy of art as being very important, and that's what Lawrence did. He's considered a significant and important part of that tradition. So what the artist would do would be he would study a subject intensely at the 135th Street Library in Harlem, which is now the Schomburg Library of African American Studies and Research, before he even began to do his interpretation. And so he's done series on the Great Migration, on the life of Harriet Tubman, which I just watched the movie Harriet the other day. On Frederick Douglass, the life of Frederick Douglass, who John Brown knew and tried to convince to go on this failed mission to free the slaves. He also did the history of the Negro. The DIA bought this series from that he did, that the artist did in 1941, while in New Orleans on his honeymoon with his wife Gwendolyn Knight, who was also an experienced and accomplished artist herself. She had helped him do a number of paintings on his other work. His style, if you're looking at this first piece, is really kind of expressionistic, and sometimes he even does cubism, like Picasso. He has bold, saturated, unmixed colors. There's flatness, there's not perspective, and it's really striking and emotionally impactful. So looking at this first panel of 22 panels, what you see is a white man being crucified with a very dark background. This is representing John Brown's fanatical belief that he was chosen by God to overthrow slavery in the United States. The following three panels show his attempts to raise money, and the following 17 panels graphically depict episodes from his formulation to use physical force to set slaves free, leading to his attempt to seize the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia. This is John Brown. I'm sorry, this is not John Brown. This is Jacob Lawrence. And Jacob Lawrence, I'm not exactly, let's see, do we have a date on this? This was courtesy of his biography. He was an accomplished artist. So now here's slide number 19, which is his march to Harper's Ferry. And look how he represents it. He marched there with 21 men, both black and white, but you don't see the men, you don't see them marching. What you see are the emotional impact of the bayonets lit up like they're God's lightning rods. And you can see the motion that he was able to put into these just by the way he creates the paintings and the way he adjusts the angles of the frames and the way he moves things up and down. So while it appears really flat and as if he wasn't creating any perspective, you feel the emotional impact on that. Then moving on, this is the next frame. He was unsuccessful. He held the armory for a few hours, but the United States Army routed him out, chased him down, captured him. And here the Lawrence is showing him alone, captured, holding a cross, his bent long hair. What's he thinking? Is he sorry that he did it? Is he having regrets? Does he feel like it's worthwhile? He knows he's going to be executed. What's he thinking at this point? We don't know what's in his mind right now, but we can see the emotional impact that Lawrence puts into this.
It's amazing. It really is amazing, Howard. It's both reflective, you know, the way he is, and it's also maybe shows his devotion to his cause. You know, it's almost like prayer. It subjects itself to many interpretations. It's extraordinary. It really is.
Thanks, Ray. You're right. You're right. Well, here he is on December 2nd, 1859. John Brown was hanged for treason against the United States for attempting to end slavery through an armed uprising. You know, these panels were done on paper in gouache and tempera, which is an opaque watercolor. And the artist mixed his own pigments. And unfortunately, he used an unstable mixture. And so when these papers are hung vertically, the pigment flakes off, so they can't be shown. So the original work can't be shown. In 1977, the DIA commissioned Lawrence to create a new series that could be shown while these were put into conservation to be saved and to protect it. They wanted him to do it in oil so that we could show all 22. But Lawrence did not like working in oil and felt that the oil wouldn't reflect the same kind of sense and color that the gouache did. So what he did was he did it in also a light sensitive but more stable screen print. So now we're at least able to show 3 pieces at a time. But come down to the DIA. Well, no, it's not. I don't think it's on display now, right, Ray?
No, it's not. Unfortunately, it's not. Yeah, because
it's not on view now because we have our cars exhibition.
Exactly.
But when we rehang it, you will be able to see 3 of the 22 pieces. Our curators rotate those pieces, and there are 22 photographs of each print. So you'll be able to see all of those. Christine, are there any questions?
Not at this time, Howard, but Valerie is with us. Do you have any additional comments, Valerie?
Yeah, I love the idea that you know, this is the only series he did honoring a white person who fought against slavery. I know that John Brown is often taught as being fanatical and sometimes, you know, like crazy, but I often thought some of that was highly exaggerated, that, you know, he grew up with a father who thought too that slavery was sort of like the worst kind of crime that anybody could commit against another human being. So John Brown heard this most of his life growing up, you know, even from the time he was a child. And John Brown is considered a hero to many African Americans because, you know, he made the ultimate sacrifice. He was willing to die in his fight against slavery. So I'm just glad he did this series, so it gives us a chance for people to learn about John Brown. I know there was that series that was on TV recently with Ethan Hawke, I think, playing John Brown.
Yeah, right.
So he's an important figure.
Valerie, I also read in the John Brown catalog for the series that they did that when he drove down to New Orleans on his honeymoon was the first time that Jacob Lawrence experienced the Jim Crow laws and the terrible segregation. And so that also had a big impact on him when he was down there.
Oh, sure, because he really grew up. I think when he was very young, he lived in Atlantic City. He had no experience of the South until he went south for his honeymoon. And he was so, in many ways, upset by seeing, you know, the Jim Crow laws, the things saying that only whites could drink from certain fountains, and you know, all that really upset him. So he started. He had already done some research on the John Brown series, but he started while he was on his honeymoon in the bedroom. He was on the floor, starting to you know, do work on this series. So he was clearly pretty moved, you know.
Ray, how would your wife have felt if you were working on your honeymoon?
You know, after 35 years, I don't think she would mind anymore.
All right, time to move on to our next piece.
Yeah, and speaking of segregation and Jim Crow laws, this is a wonderful work by Benny Andrews from 1963. It's called Southern Pastures. It's big. It's about 5 feet tall, over 5 feet tall, and it's 3 feet wide. It's a collage and oil paint on canvas. Could you go to the next slide, Howard? Here we have on the right the photo of Andrews, and on the left, this is Andrews' self-portrait called Portrait of a Collagist, which, you know, also has his collage and oil paint and on the canvas. And both Southern Pastures and this particular self-portrait are owned by the DIA, and they're both up in the galleries. So it gives a visitor a chance to see what we've been talking about today. Andrews was born in 1930, and he grew up in a sharecropper cabin near Madison, Georgia. After the Korean War, he took advantage of the GI Bill and he attended the art school that was associated with the Art Institute of Chicago. Andrews became an influential political activist and a figurative painter. Figurative painting, which represents an image, was not in favor at the time that Andrews started his art career because abstract painting dominated the art world. Andrews incorporated this collage technique in his paintings. This is affixing to the canvas cloth or clothing. For instance, in this self-portrait, the pants, those are actually pants that are affixed to the canvas. He used this collage technique in his art to give it a sense of rawness. Andrews also tended to use flat colors, compressed spaces, and minimalist backgrounds. Could you go to the next slide, Howard? Howard, what do you notice about this?
Well, this painting is not as a happy painting as the other painting was. This painting has barbed wire in it and a tree and what I think is a mom and her daughter, and they're reaching out as if they're trying to get to something they can't get to.
Right, you've got a mother and a daughter behind barbed wire fence, and the painting concerns the nefarious practice of segregation, what you were just referring to with respect to Lawrence. After the Civil War, many states, particularly in the South, enacted what we were referring to as Jim Crow laws that prohibited blacks from white establishments and white institutions. In 1954, the Supreme Court reversed an earlier decision upholding those laws and declared segregation to be unconstitutional. However, segregation persisted. And the civil rights movement in the 1960s was very much in reaction to this culture of white supremacy that's established by the Jim Crow laws. So here you have the barbed wire, which represents a metaphor for school segregation and the barriers African American children faced in equal educational opportunities. The daughter, Howard, looks yearningly toward the opportunity to attend a much better white school. But the mother's posture and figure shows her torn emotions. Her right hand appears to point or lead toward opportunity. The opportunity for her daughter to have a better education and a better future. But her left hand, however, seems to be holding her daughter back, perhaps representing her mother's apprehension of the risk of harm to her daughter, both physically and emotionally, as desegregation was met with serious, even grave hostility. So that conflict of the mother's emotion is further demonstrated by, you see her unsteady feet, Howard? You know how sort of the right one is sort of toed in like that? Again, Andrews is sort of expressing the dynamics of the emotion of segregation and then the opportunity of desegregation in a difficult environment. In 1969, Andrews established the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition, which represented major art museums for the lack of, they protested major art museums for the lack of art in exhibitions and created, they were really disturbed by the fact that the art being shown was not of African American or other ethnic or racial minorities. Andrews also frequently wrote editorials supporting and defending the quality of African American artists' work. Andrews' efforts were to counter the reality that he faced in his art, as well as other African American artists. They were excluded from major galleries and particularly museums because they were understood to be essentially white male institutions. So in other words, Andrews, like the girl in the painting, was on the other side of a wire barrier and wanted the same opportunity as the white artist. Fortunately, over time, that reality changed a bit for him, and toward the end of Andrews' life, mainstream art began to accept and admire Andrews' work. Christine, any questions? And I I'm hoping that if Valerie's still with us, if she has anything to add, that would be terrific.
There was a question in regard to the medium, and then Valerie, anything you'd like to chime in about?
So do you want me to answer that question, Christine,
Oh,
about the medium?
sure.
Absolutely.
Okay. It is, the painting is a mixture to some extent of oil paint as well as collage. When Vinnie Andrews worked with paint, he often applied it very thickly. He is an expressionist painter, and that's sort of part of it, part of his the approach they use. But he also, in using collage, he had his own distinct way of using collage. And if you stand in front of this painting, you know, especially like looking at the mother's figure, she almost appears very sculptural because there's so much cloth in her dress that it seems up almost like she's about to be represented in the round. But that is how he worked with collage. It's very well done. This is a painting that's requested a lot by other museums. And as many of you know, it hasn't gone anywhere because I feel we need it here for our museum. And it's very much one of my favorite paintings by him. But this is when he began to use this collage technique in '63. And is there anything else you want to know? I'll be glad to answer. I would say that Andrews was a very admired artist, loved by a lot of people, because he was an expressionist artist who dealt with most of his paintings had some kind of message and dealt with what was going on in the world. So they were very relatable. And he was also so much of an activist. And he spoke up for, when he demonstrated, for example, in front of the Metropolitan Museum in New York when they had the Harlem on My Mind show. He was demonstrating for artists of color, particularly African American artists, but he was also demonstrating for women. He felt that, women, no matter what race they were, they had no opportunities in museums. So he was much admired by a lot of artists, black and white, because of how much he spoke up against some of the, unfairnesses in the art world. And very talented artists were being ignored and given no opportunity. So he's a hero to a lot of people. He really did start doing well, I would think, maybe in the last 25 or 30 years of his life. He just became so famous. He did prison programs where he worked with prisoners to teach them about art, So he was, again, quite an incredible human being.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Very
Sure.
Thank you, Valerie.
Christine, any other questions?
There's a question. One of the viewers said that they were at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts and saw a complete set of Jacob Lawrence's work, Jacob Lawrence's work there. So it's going back to the last piece, but it was a comment that was
So
shared.
it was just to say, after he did this work, he figured out that his pigments were being mixed wrong, and they started mixing them right. So the pieces that he did afterwards were more stable.
Yeah. Can I just point out too, Howard, when he did the John Brown series, he's very young. He's only about 24 years old. So like a lot of artists, he's learning a lot, So the thing about the issue of how he was using the pigments and all that, some of that's quite natural for some artists. They learn about, they make not terrible mistakes, but they have issues with their technique sometime, and then over the years they perfect it, So, but I just think it's so incredible. He was doing this at 24 years old.
I agree. Absolutely. All right, let's move
Right,
on.
Howard, you're up. Speaking of unstable.
So,
stop.
So Betty Saar, who did this piece, is a sculptural artist. She creates art in a container. She uses found objects, what other people would consider junk, she considers valuable and important and can repurpose them to very meaningful spiritual pieces, like this piece called Beyond Midnight or Magie Noir, which is called Black Magic. And she did this piece, so now she did this piece in 2002, and I don't want to give away her age because we were talking about Jacob Lawrence, who was 24, but she was 74 when she did this piece. And she's still active today. And so she's still doing amazing work today. In fact, she's had numerous exhibitions all over the place. But last year was the first time she had an exhibition at MoMA. And when asked how she felt about finally having an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, she said, it's about time. So that's Betty, and I appreciate her for who she is. Throughout her career, she's created objects that examine identity, spirituality, and visually question people's stereotypes. For example, in 1972, now this is not our piece, this is at the Berkeley Art Museum, she did this piece called The Liberation of Aunt Jemima. We all know who Aunt Jemima is. She's that traditional, stereotypic, racial mammy figure that, you know, you're all supposed to love and as everybody, you know, is everybody's grandma. Except what Betty did was she put her in a container, and in the opposite side of where the broom is, a typical domestic stereotype Black woman, she put a hand grenade and a gun. So she's really blown up, literally almost, the stereotype of the Black grandma figure. In fact, just recently, finally, the Aunt Jemima Pancakes has changed their name to the Parker Mills, is that it? Parlor Mills Company. Let's go back to our piece. She takes a different stereotype this time and turns it upside down. She's speaking to, in our piece, she's speaking to the spiritual and examining the customs and beliefs of African culture, both as practiced in Africa and the Black diaspora in the United States and Canada. So let's look at this piece and see what we have. It's a wooden box, 26 inches by 18 inches. It contains a black diamond-shaped cloth with white dots, the only white area on it. Inside it are these four rhomboid-shaped wooden pieces that are the Weiner rods, which we'll talk about in a second. And there's also a lot of symbols around the side. There's this hand, there's keys, there's a little figure called the Malago figure. There's a Christian cross up here. There's a little pharaoh. There's a candle. There's a moon and stars. There's these intertwined snakes. So, you know, what do they all mean and what is she doing? In this piece, she's making an ironic commentary about color consciousness. The title itself carries a double meaning. Beyond Midnight is the witching hour, right? The witching hour is the darkest time of night. It's the time when black magic occurs. And it intimates that dark is bad, that dark skin is bad, that dark skin is a signifier of the undesirable. But now the artist is reimagining this term and implies a transformative power that emerges from the darkness. Sar signifies a benevolent power by casting this woman, this dark-skinned woman, as a positive healer, as a powerful healer and seer, a person who can divine the future. So let's look at what these symbols mean. So this, if you can see my pointer, this intertwined snake is representative of a Haitian deity called Dambala, the father figure, the father creator of life. These Malago figures are Southern Mexican, Southern United States figures of healing that are used in the healing process. This figure, the keys, are representative of, it's a metaphor for women's knowledge and being unable to lock the spirituality of the world. The hand itself is a representative of a Yoruba cultural proverb. Yoruba is a African culture, and it's saying your hand is yourself, and you have your destiny. You create yourself with your own hand. And in addition to that, the bird in the topmost figure, let me just go back here for a second. The bird up here is also a Yoruba figure. A bird is a spiritual figure that it flies into the sky and can speak with the spirits and speak with your ancestors. So now what you can't see is there's a mesh covering her photograph. And the mesh is representative of the amniotic sac during birth. Occasionally, when a baby is born, it's born with the amniotic sac around its face. And that's considered a great omen. That means that that person is going to be imbued with great spirituality and will have the power of healing and the power to be a great seer. So, and that's coming from African culture, which was brought to the world when the Africans were brought here in chains. So Miss Sarr is visually turning the stereotype within the culture that light-skinned people are better than dark-skinned people in Beyond Midnight. She is celebrating darkness as a strength, power, and spirituality of the seer. And this is a wonderful portrait of the artist from a exhibition, Now Dig This Art, in Black Los Angeles, and that was taken a number of years ago. So, Christine, this is an important piece that is up on view right now, and when you go to the DIA, now that you know the story, it could be even more meaningful to you. Are there any questions?
The question was whether this was a self-portrait or not, or whether she considered putting herself into this piece.
Well,
maybe Valerie can
address that better than me.
I'll be happy to answer that. No, this is not a self-portrait. Betty herself is quite fair-skinned. The photo you see there, she is kind of in shadow, but Betty is probably in that photo. I mean, she definitely is much younger because Betty is, again, in her 90s today, but she's still quite sort of gorgeous and very, very energetic and still works a lot. But this is really, a photo I believe she found through all her researches and all. She goes to flea markets and buys a lot of objects that interest her. What I always find incredible is how Betty has this, creative ability to put sort of all the right elements together and to create a work of art, and it all sort of comes together as it does in this assemblage. But I saw this work in an exhibition Betty did for the Michael Roosevelt Gallery, because they represent her in New York. And, all the work in that show had to do with African Americans still being hung up on issues of skin color. And so there were works that, definitely to some extent, were favorable to people who were light skinned, but I mean, in a very positive way. But basically had a lot to do with Betty being surprised that this was still an issue in African American culture. This notion that light-skinned people were better than dark-skinned people. So she wanted to celebrate darkness through this work and through this woman as this sort of powerful seer. I do like this work a lot. I think the portrait, whoever that woman is quite beautiful. And the way Betty, integrated it and put it as a central focus in this assemblage.
Thank you, Valerie.
Sure.
I appreciate that. I think that we are ready to talk about this piece, and this piece is Ray's piece.
Yes, and this one is also up. The one that we just saw is up, and this one is also up. It's actually across from Southern Pasture in one of the galleries. It's called The Fire Next Time by Vincent Smith. It's from 1968. It's not very large, but it's very captivating in the gallery. It's 22 inches tall, and it's about 32.5 inches wide. It's oil paint and sand mixed together applied to the canvas. Next slide, Howard, please. Here's a photo of Smith. He was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1929. He worked in many mediums, and he often combined representational and abstract styles. As Sharon Patton describes in her book about African American art, it's an interesting story. In 1952, when Smith was just 22 years old, he became inspired to quit his job in the post office and study art when a friend who was an artist took him to see the Paul Cézanne exhibition at the Modern Museum of Art and to a display of African art at the Brooklyn Museum. This early inspiration shaped his artistic focus. Indeed, many years later, Smith describes his work as to be, quote, a marriage between Africa and the West, end of quote. Smith went on to receive a scholarship from an art school in Maine, and his early successful works chronicled contemporary African and African American urban and everyday life. His focus was on this subject matter was in part a reaction to his perception about Main Street art. He's quoted as saying, quote, I didn't see anything reflecting the Black experience or Black contribution to American culture, end of quote. He was deeply influenced by the stark and simple forms of Jacob Lawrence, who Howard just presented in our first piece, and he was also influenced by the colors and shapes of expressionist art and the flat perception and perspective of Cézanne. Next slide, Howard. In the mid-1960s and 1970s, civil rights protests, activists, and political prisoners were a major part of Smith's aesthetic focus. He was an active member of the Black Arts Movement, which was founded by his friend and playwright, Amari Bakara. It was a Black pride movement that was particularly vigorous and action-oriented. This image exemplifies the social and political concerns of the writers and artists associated with that movement. Next slide, Howard. The painting, called The Fire Next Time, is inspired by James Baldwin's 1962 book of the same name. The book, and you see Baldwin on the left and the book on the right. The book is essentially a warning of the consequence of continued racial injustice, the policies of political discrimination and racial oppression, denying civil rights to African American citizens. Next slide, Howard. So this painting was painted in 1968, which was a particularly difficult and turbulent year of social and political unrest in America, with demonstrations against the war in Vietnam, rebellions in Chicago and Washington, D.C., and the unfortunate assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King and Senator Robert F. Kennedy. So you look at this painting, Howard, and I know you and I have, both shared our views on this. You have this, it's very stark, isn't it, Howard? And this painting shows these four men reacting in shock and anguish to, escaping the fire behind them. But Howard, the paint's interesting, isn't it? It's got the sand makes it look really raw, doesn't it? And
Well,
gritty.
it's a great idea for him to put the sand in there to create the grittiness and the feel of that.
Right, and actually, Valerie describes Smith to us in our training as a gritty, figurative expressionist. So you can see that when you see this in the gallery, the sand in the paint, the way that grittiness creates a sort of a rawness and a power in this painting, and it evokes perhaps emotions of despair and anguish, and certainly resolve. Any questions, Christine?
Now, at this time, unless Valerie would like to say another word or two, or we can go on to
Okay.
the next piece.
I'll just say that I actually knew Vincent in New York. He has passed away the past few years, but he was a wonderful artist and very I would say dedicated to social causes, and his work did reflect that. This is a time when there were so many in '68, where there were so many uh, you know difficult things going on in the country, as Ray indicated. But also, there were lots of rebellions, which were called riots at that time. So there were cities exploding, you know, because of African Americans' reactions to, oppression, years of oppression. Um, and so he was warning that he had warned that was going to come, and it definitely did happen. Uh, but I always have liked looking at this work, and I was so thrilled to get it for the collection. It makes me think of, Vincent was one of those artists too, very much influenced by German Expressionism, which happens to be a favorite art group of artists for me as well. And so I love the way he sort of integrated all those influences, like Jacob Lawrence's influence as an expressionist. And I just, when I look at this, I do think of African art in many respects. I also think of Jacob Lawrence's use of color and, German Expressionism. But I certainly think of Vincent.
Thank you
Thanks
so much, Valerie.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you, Val. And coincidentally, the German Expressionist room is right outside the gallery in which that painting is. And I know when we're on tours, visitors comment and can really appreciate the Expressionist influence.
Oh, yes.
Howard, I saw that we had Wiley
like
next.
Expressionist, Ray. Sounds like another tour to me. Okay. Here's one of the crowd favorites. This is up on the second floor where you stand in line to get into the special exhibitions. So when you come down, you'll be able to see this. This is a piece by Henney Wiley. It's very large, about 9 feet by 8.5 feet. And Wiley is an American painter. He was born in LA. He trained in San Francisco at the art school in San Francisco, and he also took his MFA, his Master's of Fine Art, at Yale. He's in his late 40s, and he embraces painting as a way of dispelling racial stereotypes in the same way Betty Starr does with her sculptural pieces. So he was trained in the old master style, the style, if you think European old masters, he was trained that way. He would go into museums and copy their paintings. And whenever he saw those paintings, what was he looking at? He was looking at portraits of white men from the 17th, 18th, and 19th century depicted as heroes, depicted as powerful colonial masters, depicted as the leaders of people, the people that you follow. And so while he does figurative paintings, and he also does sculpture, which is another interesting story if we had time, he refers to his historical sources. And he takes young Black African-American men, that's how he started, he's working with women now also, and he puts them in place of the white dominant person. His process is to walk the streets. In this case, he was walking the streets of Harlem, looking for somebody that he thought might be interested in having their portrait painted, that he thought would be interesting to paint. He would work with a team of people that he'd be with. So he wasn't just accosting people by himself saying, hey, let me paint your picture. He had a camera crew with him. And when he found a person that was interested in doing it, he had to go back to their studio, and they'd flip through books of European art until they found something they liked, and they would use that portrait. So let's look at what we have here. Ray, can you see my cursor or no?
You know, Howard, unfortunately, I can't.
Okay, so imagine me pointing at the picture on the right.
Here, I can point on my screen. Will that help, Howard?
That might work. So there's a picture on the right. This is the original painting that they found when they were looking through the books. It's called Officer of the Hussars Commanding a Charge, painted in 1812 by Theodore Géricault. It's in the Louvre. So you see this powerful white guy on this powerful horse, looking behind him, leading this charge. These hussars were mercenaries that worked for Napoleon. They were great horsemen and great swordsmen. Now, point your attention to the black figure on the left. Same thing, only now you have the stereotype turned upside down. You have a powerful black figure showing his poise, his courage, his ability to lead you. But he's in his own clothes. If you had a close-up of this, he'd have his Timberland boots on and his jeans, his t-shirt, and he's holding that. But you still keep the leopard saddle blanket, you still keep the sword, you still keep that jacket that he's now painted purple. But you take the background out. You take the charge out, you take the people way in the background that are following him out, and you have a decorative sense because the artist wants you to take you out of place. So these figures here that I'm pointing to, that you can't see me pointing to, are just decorative, and that's all he said. He just wanted it to be decorative in there. So Wiley uses his visual language to change what he's what you're looking at. And Wiley was selected to paint President Obama's official portrait for the National Gallery. It's a wonderful portrait. He has President Obama sitting in a chair surrounded by flowers from Kenya and from Hawaii and from Chicago. So it's a great portrait that you should look at. Christine, are there any questions about this?
Not from the audience, unless Valerie, do you have a comment before we move on, or are we good?
Valerie, here's a photograph of Wiley working on one of his portraits.
Yeah, the one there on the left where he's standing in front of the Michael Jackson one, which is huge, and then on the right you see him working on one of his paintings with a young man. Looks like he's sleeping, or hopefully just sleeping. But anyway, those are usually quite beautiful. We showed one here. I think it was called Sleep. But I was so thrilled to get this for the collection because I wanted something that would really speak to young people. And that's when I thought of Kahenda. I was walking around my galleries and I thought, we need something that really speaks to some of the people walking, who I want to see in the galleries. And I felt, his images with young men, particularly who were dressed in sort of a hip hop style, I thought, young people would really appreciate. So I went looking for the right painting. I think it really took me about a year, even though people were showing me images. But when the one popped up that we purchased, I knew right off from looking at it, the source for it. I had studied Géricault when I was in graduate school. And I just thought it would be so appropriate showing this heroic figure, but now a young black man on this rearing horse. I felt that young people here would, love it. Black men particularly, I remember so many of them being so sort of moved by it, and I remember getting hugs a lot from men who worked black men who worked in the museum, because they never saw an image like that in the museum, of a black man looking so, again, heroic in a composition like that. So, I know it's very popular. The docents always tell me that. And I know when I would come downstairs and go into the gallery for the longest time, there would be a little crowd of young people and sometimes, older people or a mixed group. And it was very diverse racially, but it attracted so much attention.
You're
And
absolutely right, Valerie.
it still does, Valerie.
It really does.
We have a question about the
Oh, sure.
frame. And did he design it? Did he create it? Did he craft it himself?
Yeah, well, the frames he uses are produced through like a kind of a mold. He designs and all. So you have these uh oh I think the piece right at the top over the young man's head, that's actually a portrait, a self-portrait of Kehinde Wiley. You see his face in that. And then the other area pieces at the corners, they're typical sort of, highly decorative uh, type of decoration you see in, I guess, Baroque art probably. But he makes these himself, and uh, when it came, we had to put that on because like with a lot of these works, it came in a separate sort of box when he shipped the painting to us. But I remember watching our conservators and collections management team putting it all together, and it was that in itself was a really moving experience watching how they handled it. I studied history painting in graduate school, so I knew from reading about Kehinde, he loves history painting. He always has since he was a kid, and he would go to museums. But he's one of these young, sort of contemporary artists who always appreciated this figurative tradition. And I understand why, because it takes a great deal of skill, and it presents these really beautiful works. But I think the challenge that we should also understand that he had is as a contemporary artist, he had to make this, if you do figurative work, you still have to make it exemplify the time period you live in for it to become of interest to the public, or really even to the art world. And he's made it, in a sense, very contemporary, even though he uses this kind of style.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Valerie.
Valerie.
You're welcome.
Okay, Ray.
This is called Bird. It's by David Hammonds, and it was created in 1990. It's over 6 feet tall, it's almost 2 feet wide, and it's 14 inches deep. Howard, could I have the next slide, please? In 1943, Hammonds was born to a poor family in Springfield, Illinois. He was the youngest of 10 children. He moved to Los Angeles in the early 60s to study art, and in 1973, he moved to New York to further his art career. Now, the subject matter of Hammonds' art was influenced by activist artists, such as Charles White, who taught Hammonds at the Otis College of Art and Design in Los Angeles. While the style of Hammonds' art was influenced by artists like Michel Duchamp, who used these ready-made objects or found objects. Our curator, Valerie Mercer, describes Hammonds as a conceptual artist who works in a variety of media, but has a distinct approach in creating unique sculptures that combine found and discarded objects. I think I got that right.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did, Ray. Very well put.
Hammonds carefully selected the objects he uses to inform the subject matter of his art. And in other words, the nature of the discarded object furthers the meaning Hammonds intends to communicate. Hammonds exploits the object's ability to signify culture and by implication represent economic and political narratives about America, particularly the African American experience in America. Next slide, Howard. So Howard, here we have interesting sculpture in the sense of found objects, and it's layered in social and political meaning. When it was acquired in 2016, the director of the DIA, Salvador Pons, explained this piece was as follows, quote, historically, the African American community has been given opportunities in sports and music and has excelled in those areas. but it has been denied other opportunities and is still caged. End of quote. So one interpretation of this work is that historically in white America, the only real opportunities for blacks has been in athletics and entertainment and not in other professions or careers. Howard, you've got this fancy bird cage. It's white. It's painted in white. And Valerie has told us that that style is in the American Victorian style, which was popular in the 1800s when there was obviously slavery and then thereafter the Jim Crow segregation laws that existed. So that cage that encircles the object in the center can be seen as a metaphor for white establishment and symbolizing the lack of opportunity beyond the cage. Howard, can you show the next slide, please?
Of course, Ray.
Thanks. So here you have inside the cage, so to speak, you have a basketball with feathers and it's encased in barbed wire. So the barbed wire further communicates the idea of trapped or the lack of opportunity. This is it. In the basketball, it's a worn basketball when you see it in the gallery, and it is up. You can see it. The basketball refers to obviously athletics, but it's obviously basketball too, which is a particularly popular sport with African Americans. Now the feathers and the title bird refers to entertainment, specifically Charlie Parker, a famous jazz saxophonist and composer who was nicknamed Bird and who Hammond's greatly admired. He did other works that he called Bird that focused on Parker. Could you go to the next slide, Howard? So, with this work, Hammond also could be communicating that young African Americans maybe should abandon that limited perspective of opportunity and perhaps through insight be inspired to explore other careers. Well, in the last 25 years, Hammond's art has been widely recognized. I think the Modern Museum of Art has 18 of his pieces. Hammond's is known to be famously reclusive. He is quiet and private and does not give interviews. He does spend time mentoring young artists, however. His avoidance of the public eye and publicity may be because he believes his art should speak for him. In a 1971 article, he wrote, quote, "I feel my art relates to my total environment, my being a Black, political, and social human being. Although I'm involved with communicating with others, I believe that my art itself is really my statement. For me, it has to be." Comments, Valerie? Questions, Christine?
Sure. We were really excited to get this for the collection. David Hammons is probably one of the most famous, well-respected contemporary artists. David can pretty much call his own shots. His works are very expensive. This is really one of the most expensive works of art we've ever purchased by an African-American artist. And I had been talking to Salvador about him. And then in no time, we were searching for work by David. And I like this work very much. I will say, I do believe that David really loves basketball. It doesn't mean he doesn't like basketball, but he's been critiquing this societal notion of promoting basketball, particularly to a lot of young Blacks as a career. Because we all know everybody can't be a Michael Jordan, if only they could. But he wants young Black men to think about, other professions. He wants society to encourage African American young men to think about other professions, like whatever business, being an artist or, teacher, entrepreneur, all kinds of things. They need the variety. And one thing about this piece, he references basketball in a lot of his work, but this is the only piece I found that where the actual basketball itself really exists. And a lot of them, he draws the basketball, or he uses the basketball shadow, or he uses elements related to the game of basketball, like the hoop and all that. But this one, he really put it in. I love the cage, the white structure. Uh, and I think somebody asked me if we could interpret that as representative of the white establishment, and sure we could, because as Ray mentioned, it does represent the particular style that was very European, but it was an American version of Victorian design. And but I think it's elegant, and that contrasted with the basketball, or just the notion of sports, I think is certainly very eye-catching. But I love the form of the structure itself. It reminds me of just a beautiful, sort of elegant line drawing. But anyway, we're thrilled to have this piece, and I think a lot of artists in Detroit are very much influenced by David Hammons too, because we have a number of artists here who work with found objects, discarded objects that they find, and they turn them into wonderful works of art. And David has been working that way for decades.
Valerie, we're thrilled to have you also as our curator. So you've come with some wonderful pieces, and I want to personally thank you for staying with us today. It was just terrific having you with us and being able to put your insight into this. I think that what we need to do is end it now, so I'm going to turn it back over to Ray, and then for final words.
Yeah, it's unfortunate we had more pieces to cover, but this has been so enjoyable. Thank you so much, Valerie, for being with us today. I just wanted to say that next week on, which is February 25th, on Thursdays at the museum, they're presenting a film called Mandabay by Senegalese, sorry about that, a little tongue trigger. Senegalese, thank you. Writer and director, Osman Sambani, and it is based on his book called The Money Order, which deals with issues of social justice and poverty. Amanda, I know you wanted to say something before we ended today.
Thank you, Ray. I did. And thank you for sticking around. I apologize that we're running a little bit over on time today, but I wanted to share some really exciting news about Thursdays at the museum. We will be changing our user experience starting in March. So I wanted all of our audience to be prepared for that transition. We are going to be moving over to YouTube. So you will no longer have to sign in anonymously. You'll be given the link, just like you always do, to enter your zip code, and then be provided a link to our YouTube page where we'll have the program. You'll see a picture like you normally do of the DIA. It'll say that our program will start at 1 p.m. with a countdown clock that you can watch. If at 1 o'clock it's not showing up on your screen, please just refresh your page. If you want to participate and just watch the program, you can do so very easily just by clicking that link. If you want to leave a comment and interact with Christine or Kimmy or our docents as you usually do, you will need to be signed into your YouTube page. You can be signed in with your normal Gmail account. I know my personal account's always logged in, so I'm always logged into YouTube just automatically as well. But if you have questions on that before we make that transition in March, please reach out to us in that comments box as you always do here on the Teams platform. We know that this transition is going to make for a better user experience, and we're looking forward to this program growing and expanding and just being better every week. So thank you for your loyalty and commitment to us. And I wanted to, again, just say thank you to Valerie for joining us today. It's always an honor to have these special guests, and we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye, everybody.